very pleased indeed to be introducing our next keynote speaker, Emily Thornberry, MP for Islington South and Finsbury since 2005 and Shadow Foreign Secretary. And Emily has a very distinguished career in Parliament. Former positions she has held with distinction include Shadow Secretary of State for Defence and Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. And Emily adopts very much a bipartisan approach, looking for solutions. And I know that she has spent a great deal of time in both Israel and in Palestine, talking to a very wide variety of people and trying to find the answer and the way forward in what many people feel is an intractable problem. Emily, looking forward to hearing your perspective on where we are and where we go next. Emily Thornberry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking BICOM and the Jewish News for inviting me to today's historic event, and once again for giving me the opportunity to emphasise the Labour Party's long-standing, unstinting and unequivocal support for the State of Israel. As I frequently remind my colleagues, Labour's support for Zionism and the establishment of a Jewish state predates even the Balfour Declaration, stating plainly that this state was one, and I quote, "to which such of the Jewish people as desire to do so may return and work their salvation, free from interference from those of alien race and religion." As Israel's envoy to the UK, Mark Regev, said, speaking last year, in the years 1917 to 1945, at Labour Party conferences, support for Zionism was expressed on no fewer than 11 separate occasions. In doing so, Labour proudly embraced a progressive internationalism, standing in solidarity with the Jewish people in righting a historic wrong. And that is why my predecessors so warmly welcomed the moment 100 years ago today, when the vision of a Jewish state became the official policy of the British government. And again, as Mark has said, we did so not just because this was the right decision, morally, historically and politically, as we prepared for the aftermath of war. We did so also because we in the socialist internationalist movement felt a true brotherhood with the early pioneers of Zionism and their egalitarian roles. We think in particular of the kibbutz movement, a group of people dedicated to establishing a more equal, communal society, free from the prejudice and persecution that they had experienced in their home countries. And even today, despite the challenges that we must address in respect of relations and rights of the Palestinian people, modern Israel stands out as a beacon of freedom, equality and democracy, particularly in respect of women and LGBT plus communities, in a region where oppression, discrimination and inequality are too often the norm. When I met the mayor of Tel Aviv during the summer, I was proud to congratulate him on the success of the Tel Aviv Pride, which welcomed over 200,000 people under the rainbow flag. And let's contrast that with events in Egypt, where even the waving of that flag at a pop concert was enough to prompt dozens of arrests and calls for the criminalisation of same-sex activity. And as we look back over the past 100 years, we must also salute the resilience and the strength of the Israeli state and the Israeli people against all those who have sought it harm and to destroy it. A resilience that has had to constantly adapt as the threats over the years has changed from the conventional warfare of 50 years ago to the ever-shifting tactics of terrorists today. But while the threats have changed, the underlying theme has not. It is the denial of Israel's right to exist, and there should be no place in modern society, and let me stress, no place in the Labour Party for anyone who holds that type of abhorrent view. And I say to you today what I said to Labour Friends of Palestine at the Brighton conference just a few weeks ago, that anyone who believes in a two-state solution loses all right to a hearing if they simultaneously indulge those who deny one of those states its very right to exist. And above all, that is why the Balfour Declaration is so important, because it enshrines the existence of the Jewish state and the rights of the people as a formal principle of our foreign policy, and that will never, ever change. But in looking back at the past 100 years, we must also look forward. After all, if Lord Balfour had been told 100 years on, his letter would be the subject of all these commemorations, debated and discussed today by news channels all over the world, he would doubtless have been amazed. But I would like to think that even so, he would not have changed a word of his declaration. Put simply, his words have not just stood the test of time, they have also passed the judgment of history. But there is a lesson in that for all politicians and leaders, and that is this, that our actions, even our words today, can have implications and consequences for decades to come, and we must take them carefully and soberly with that in mind. But let us also be honest. If Balfour were able to look back now at relations between Israel and Palestine, one community facing the constant threat of terror, the other trapped in grinding, inescapable poverty, what would he think? If Balfour was able to look across Europe today, not least in Britain, and see anti-Semitism once again on the rise, and Zionist being used as a term of abuse, if Balfour could see those things today, I don't believe that he would be celebrating. I believe that he would instead ask all of us to regard his declaration, even after 100 years, as unfinished business. Consider the line which states that the declaration should not prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. A section included because many feared that the very existence of a Jewish state could give anti-Semites the excuse to try and push Jews out of their current homes. And that threat, let's face it, has not gone away. And when we see members of the Jewish community in Britain having to stand guard over their synagogues and their schools, we know that the most basic right of our Jewish community, the right to safety and security, is still in serious jeopardy. Consider also Balfour's promise that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. That too, at best, at the very best, is still a work in progress. So while marking the centenary, we must also be honest and say that until Jewish communities all over the world are free from the threat of terror and the scourge of anti-Semitism, until the rights of Palestinian people are secured and we have a viable, secure, internationally recognized Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with the state of Israel, then the work that Balfour started will still not be complete. I first visited the Middle East nearly 40 years ago when my father was stationed there for his work with the United Nations. And since then, I've returned many times, most recently for the funeral of Shimon Peres. And I'll be visiting Israel and Palestine again next week. But over the years, one thing has particularly struck me, that every time I've returned, the divisions between the Israeli and the Palestinian communities appear more entrenched. The social interactions I used to see when I first visited seem increasingly rare, and we see actions taken on a daily basis that seem to entrench the divisions even deeper, to a point where the gap seems almost impossible to bridge. Whether it is the despicable practice of glorifying terrorism to children by naming schools after suicide bombers, or the way in which support for illegal settlement building and the demolition of Palestinian homes has become almost a political purity test for some in the Knesset. And yet, as views harden and become more bitter on both sides, it is not as though the wishes of a mother for her child have changed. And mothers, whether they are in West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem, have the same wishes for their children as I have for my own. First and foremost, we want peace and security. We want freedom from fear or poverty, but also the prospect of a bright future, the opportunity to have a life that is better than ours. And yet, that hope, as things stand, looks like a pipe dream. As things stand, the young Israeli child will grow up in a world where air raids, car rammings, and random stabbings remain a common fact of life, and where military service will remain not just a compulsion, but a necessity, because they live in a country surrounded by hostile neighbours who deny their very right to exist. And the young Palestinian child will grow up in a world where they are more likely than not to be unemployed, reliant on humanitarian aid, and unable to shape their own future, let alone enjoy a life better than their parents. And my greatest fear is that Israelis and Palestinians become more isolated from one another, and they increasingly lose opportunities to remember one another's common humanity. And as that happens, the prospect for a political solution to secure security and stability, peace and prosperity throughout the region and for the long term, that prospect starts to disappear. And what's more, the incentives for politicians, whether in Israel or Palestine, whether it's Washington or London, to take courageous steps to try and break the deadlock or expend political capital on this issue, that prospect also disappears. But as I said earlier, the lessons of Balfour, the one thing that we must remember above all today, is that bold steps and brave statements are not only necessary, but can resonate for generations to come. Whereas the judgment of history will not be kind to politicians who simply do nothing, but let a bad situation get worse. 100 years on from Balfour, we are reminded that the words and actions of politicians can make a difference. So on this anniversary, I hope all politicians will take the opportunity to reflect on how they will be remembered in 100 years, and whether they will use the time that they have to try and make decisive action in the Middle East to complete Balfour's mission and to work for stability, security, and peace.
I think we have time for a few questions. I'm going to take three together. Yes, this gentleman here, and behind him, and is there anyone else? And here.
A very simple question. Is Jeremy Corbyn a Zionist?
Are we going to take three or something together? Yeah, we'll
take three.
Okay, cool.
There's a hand up there.
Thank you, Emily, for making it clear your personal support for Israel and a two-state solution. It's music to the ears of anyone in the Jewish community who, whether you're Labour or Conservative, can feel sort of a bit out of loop. My question is this: what do you think? What do you think on the Palestinian side? Because it's very clear from the Israeli side in terms of settlement stuff. We hear what Labour expects from Israel. What do you think specifically on the Palestinian side to achieve that two-state solution needs to be done around issues of incitement, like you mentioned?
Right, and the third one here.
All right, sorry, two quick questions, please. First of all, yeah, can you hear me? One question.
I may only answer one, but go on, ask me both.
So my understanding was that this is a celebration of the Balfour Declaration. A few days ago, you said in a speech that it's not a thing that should be celebrated, but marked. So my question really is, why are you here?
Okay.
Emily.
I thought you were going to ask me too.
No, I'm solemnly.
All right, okay. Don't be so obedient. So let me just start with yours. I mean, as I made clear in my speech, I do think that if Balfour himself was here today, he wouldn't see the current situation in Israel and Palestine as one to celebrate. He would see it as something, as a job that has only been half done. And if he saw the rise in anti-Semitism that is happening across the world, he would not see that as something to celebrate. So it is for that reason that I believe that it is a very important anniversary. It is something that we have to mark. It was a pivotal point in terms of history, but I do think that we need to fulfill the whole promise of Balfour. Is Jeremy Corbyn a Zionist? Well, Jeremy believes in a two-state solution, as I do, as the Labour Party does, as is our policy. And so you can read from that if Zionism is a support of the establishment and support of the Israeli state, then of course. But I mean, it seems to me to be self-evident. And what can the Palestinians do? You're absolutely right. I think that what we need to have on both sides is we need to have less of the incitement, and we need to have much more of a genuine attempt to reach out to both communities, because in the end, both communities want the same thing. We need to have two communities living in peace and prosperity next to each other, and we need to start establishing trust. And that trust in terms of Israel is unlikely to be able to be forthcoming whilst they continue to be subject to terrorist attack and to bombings and so forth. And so, of course, that is incumbent on the Palestinian community to ensure that everything is done in order to essentially make sure that they know what I believe, that everything that should be done at the moment in relation to Israel and Palestine, if we want to have a lasting peace and we want to have lasting justice, is we have to have a two-state solution. And politicians' actions should be judged against whether or not what they are doing is in furtherance of that or going back from that.
Right, we'll take one more then.
Jonathan Harris, do you have a view on what's happening in Syria right now as Daesh, as ISIS is defeated, whether other countries and groups are filling the gaps, and whether those groups such as Iran, groups that are supported by Iran, represent a threat to British interests in the Middle East?
I think I saw another hand up round there. Yes?
My question is, you've talked about Labour's official policy being to support a two-state solution. Would it help if your boss, Mr Corbyn, therefore totally disowned his previous support for Hamas and Hezbollah, who obviously do not believe in a two-state solution, and also disowned any organisation he'd previously had any dealings with that also doesn't agree with a two-state solution?
And the final question right at the back there, yes, then.
Emily, can I first say that I thought your contribution was absolutely brilliant, so thank you for that. Can I ask a simple question? Maybe the answer might be more difficult. Do you think it would help the peace process if the British government recognised the state of Palestine in order to have equality with their recognition of the state of Israel?
Right, Emily, I think in those questions you've got a lot of key thematic issues.
So the first one being about Syria. I mean, I agree. I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what Boris Johnson says, but sometimes I do. And when Boris said that there were regions in the area that were being used as a proxy war, I think that he's right. I think that many of the groups within, I think that's what has been happening in Syria is that we've had a multifaceted civil war, which has not been assisted by the countries in the region, essentially with client groups, and there being a proxy war going on, which makes the situation in Syria so difficult. And in the end, it's not glamorous. It takes a long time. It is profoundly frustrating. But the only answer in Syria, it seems to me, is we have to have international talks, and we have to find a political solution to what we do in relation to Syria. You know, it is not a solution to continue to bomb the area. It doesn't seem to me that that is a way forward. We have to bring parties together, and the longer this goes on, the more difficult it is, and the more other countries are involved, the more difficult it is. And that's why I would urge people to withdraw from that situation and to actually get round a negotiating table instead. In relation to Hamas, I mean, I think that Jeremy has attempted to explain this, and many of us have, and I'm more than happy to take this opportunity to clarify this once more. There was a dialogue meeting in the House of Commons in 2009, and a number of groups were there, and there were discussions about the future of Israel and Palestine. And it is a form of politeness to call someone a friend when you are in a dialogue meeting. I appreciate, and Jeremy appreciates, that is something that can be misinterpreted, and he regrets using the word friend. He has been critical of Hamas and Hezbollah, and he certainly does not see them as friends, but he appreciates that they are crucial players in the Middle East, and that any discussion in relation to the future of Israel and Palestine will need in some way to incorporate some form of, even if it's indirect discussions with Hamas, there is no lasting peace without bringing everyone in together. And as for recognition, yes, I think that we should. I think that we should recognise Palestine. I'm just looking here from a quote. I think it's from Boris once more. So here I am praying in aid, Boris once more. But he has said that we need to recognise Palestine, but that the question is, at what stage is it appropriate for us to do so? And my view is that now is the time. Boris affirmed that Boris yesterday in the House of Commons affirmed that it's British policy to recognise the state of Israel, state of Palestine. It's a question of when it will best serve the interests of peace. He said, for Israel, the birth of a Palestinian state would safeguard its the demographic future as a Jewish democracy, and for Palestinians, a state of their own would allow them to realise their aspirations for self-determination and self-government. I think that's very wise, and I think that it's correct, and I think it's for that reason that we should be marking Balfour by recognising Palestine.
Right, well, thank you very much, Emily, for speaking to us and answering those questions.